Hi, I'm Mace Jabenis, and I was born in Kansas City on May the 28th, 1921. My mother was born in Des Moines, Iowa, and she moved, her father had a truck farm gardening in Leavenworth, Kansas, and she grew up in Leavenworth. Then my father was born on the Russian-Polish border, and he came from Poland. I can't remember the exact year, but I'm guessing it was around 1915 that he came to the United States, and he met my mother through some friends and in Leavenworth, Kansas, and he married her, and they moved to Kansas City, Missouri. And I was born in Kansas City, and I think it was the old Grace Hospital back in those days. I don't remember exactly where it was located, but at any rate, my father had a clothing store, new and used clothing, and my father unfortunately was blind from the time I was about 9 or 10 years old until he passed away. And I have two brothers, an older brother, Eli, and a younger brother by the name of Lawrence. Eli lives in Omaha, Nebraska at this time, and my younger brother, Larry, lives in Kansas City, Missouri, or I should say Overland Park, Kansas. And those are the two brothers I have. Both my mother and my father passed away a good many years ago.
Mace, what was your mother's maiden name?
My mother's maiden name was Sarah Perlman.
And do you know much about her family?
Yeah, my mother had, excuse me, my mother had one sister who was older than her and two brothers. And the older sister married a gentleman by the name of Max. Their last name was Flightman, and Max was Max was a wood carver, and he worked, and they met in Leavenworth, Kansas. And Max was a wood carver, and he carved merry-go-round horses.
Mace, can you tell me more about this brother-in-law, the wood
No,
carver?
he wasn't my brother-in-law. He was my uncle.
Okay.
He was my Aunt Annie, my mother's sister's husband, and Uncle Max. And he came from Russia. He was a small man, but he was quite an artist, and he carved merry-go-round horses for the manufacturers of merry-go-rounds in Leavenworth, Kansas, and that goes way back. After he got to Kansas City and lived there, Uncle Max went in the furniture business, and of course he had a wood workshop in the back, and he carved various things for various people, flowered picture frames and that type of thing. And I remember one time he carved the 10 Commandments with a lion on each side for one of the new little smaller synagogues in Kansas City. But he was quite a guy.
How about your mother's other siblings?
My other siblings, my mother's brother, Uncle Benny, worked in the grocery business all his life, and he was a kind of a different kind of a fella. He did go in the service for a couple 3 years during World War II. And the older brother, Uncle Abe, took up. He was a salesman for medical books or doctor books way back in those days, and from that he gravitated toward medicine, and he started a company out of Borger, 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 Texas, and he called it the Miniature Drug Company. And he was a forerunner of I can't say he was a forerunner of the medicine man, but he did have a van, and he stocked it with all kinds of drugs and that type of thing. And he had bins in the side of the truck, and he'd travel from town to town. He'd call on the drug stores, and he'd go in and he could fill their order right now. And that was kind of interesting to me. And Uncle Abe did that for a good many years.
Now, how did your mother's family end up in Des Moines?
Well, that's when she was a child. I don't know how they ended up in Des Moines. That's where they all came from. I think when my grandfather and grandmother probably went there, and he had a small tailor shop when they got there, and I don't know how long they had that for probably 5 or so years, and then they wanted to get into farming, and then that's when they moved to Leavenworth, Kansas.
Did you know your grandparents on your mother's side?
I knew my grandmother. I never knew my grandfather. He passed away before I was born. But they tell the story about him, and his name was Elias Perlman. That's my brother Eli is named after him. And my mother told me the story about his folks. His folks lived in they were from the Russian-Polish border there, and they were in the fish peddling business. They had a big wagon, and they'd get fish from the fishermen on that river or lake, and they would travel from there to various towns and sell the fish. And back in those days, like they do today, in some places they will drive cars across a lake. In those days, they drove the wagons across the lake in the wintertime, and he was driving his team of horses with his wife across the lake in Russia, and the ice broke, and it drowned both he and this would have been my great grandfather. Both he and my great grandfather. Both he and his wife and the horses were all drowned. And from after that, he lived at home with a sister who was unkind to him. And when he got to be about 13 or 14 years old, he made his way to the United States and came over here. So that's all I know about him.
What can you tell me about your father's side of the family?
My father had 5 brothers, and they were over in the old country. I think they were primarily shoemakers, or in the shoe industry, that type of work. And my father was the first of the 6 brothers to come to the United States. And like I say, I think he came over about 1914, 1916, in that area. And he came over here and he found work, and then he went into the clothing business.
What brought him to this part of the country?
Well, he had an aunt. A Tanta Stern, and they knew that she'd come here, and so that was the reason they came. And my father was the first one, I believe, that came, and then after him, one by one, they came over.
The other brothers?
The other brothers.
Were you very close to them growing up?
I was close to all of my uncles. I was fairly close to all of my uncles, and most all of them had children. So I had a lot of cousins down in Kansas City.
So it was a good childhood.
Yes, it was.
What are your memories of growing up at home?
Well, you give me a hard one there. We always had a fairly decent family life at home until my father had gone blind, and then that made things much more difficult. And he continued to work, but then until I was about 17 years old, and then he passed away. But my younger brother my father used to go to work every day, and he'd take a streetcar downtown where he had a little clothing store, and I would take him up to the streetcar in the morning, or my younger brother would. And my younger brother used to go up there every night, and he'd come home on the streetcar, and the conductors all knew him and let him off at the right spot, and he walked home with my younger brother.
Were things pretty tough at that time?
We lived it through the Depression, and it was tough. It was tough. There's a lot of things that we didn't have, but we always had a decent meal. We always got along okay. And my mother, after that, after my father passed away, or a little bit before that, she went into the antique business. She found a small space in a building right next to where my father had his clothing store, and she started an antique store. And she bought and sold antiques, and that's the way she made a living.
What are your memories of your father?
Well, my father was a kind of a somber type of a fellow. He was when he was with his contemporaries, he was great conversationalist, but at home he was kind of a quiet individual. Didn't have a lot to say.
And how about your mother?
My mother was very intelligent, and she was interesting, and she worked with all of us boys. She was great.
And growing up, did you get along pretty good with your brothers?
Well, I got along with them pretty good, yeah. We had our differences, like any boys will. And I spent a lot of time in the Boy Scouts. Both my older brother Eli and myself and my younger brother Larry Lawrence were all three Boy Scouts, and we were Eagle Scouts. All three of us were Eagle Scouts.
What do you remember, Mace, about your school days? Elementary school on.
I went to a school in the neighborhood. Excuse me. I went to a school in the neighborhood called Faxon School, which was about 7 or 8 blocks from where we lived in Kansas City. And I went through Faxon School, which was the elementary grade school. And then I went to Westport High School, Westport Junior High. And then when my father was completely blind, we moved close to downtown close to the store, and we moved to an address called 215 West 18th Street. And I went to a school over there called Westside Junior High. I went to that school for about a year and a half, and then when I finished up there, I went to Westport High School. And I went through Westport High School, and I graduated from there.
Did you go on to college?
No, I just went. I had a little business training. I always had a job. Always worked after school.
I suppose that after your father took ill and when he passed away, it was probably up to your mother and you boys to provide for the family.
That's
wasn't it?
right. That's right.
So did you work during your school years?
I always worked. I worked at a toy manufacturing company when I was about probably 13 or 14 years old. Before you could do it, and in those days you could get by doing that. Today they wouldn't allow anybody that young to go to work. But I worked for the toy manufacturing company for several years, manufacturing stuffed toys. And the man's name was Henry Rosenberg in Kansas City. It grew to be a sizable company. It was Columbia Toy Products Company. And then after a good many years, Henry passed away, and then his brother took over the business.
What was your job working there?
Well, I did cutting. I cut material, and then I oversaw some of the girls on the sewing machines. I kind of just helped run the place to a degree.
Do you remember what kind of money you earned in those years?
Not very much. If you were making $50 an hour, you were doing good. That was big money.
And then did the boys contribute to the household?
Yeah, to some. Each of us when we worked, why we gave some, paid some money to Mom.
Did any of you help out in your mom's store?
I used to a little bit.
Did you get to learn a little bit about antiques?
Yeah, I think I know more about antiques than either of my brothers do. And I've always liked antiques.
What did your brothers do? Your older brother, what did he do?
Well, he worked, my brother Eli worked for a luggage factory in Kansas City and Bettinger Trunk Company. And he helped in the factory there. He worked in the factory for a number of years.
And your younger brother, Larry?
My younger brother Larry went through high school, and then when he went to college, he studied pharmacy, and he became a pharmacist. And he ultimately ended up with a couple of drugstores in Kansas City and in Kansas City, Kansas.
After high school, then, what did you stay with the toy factory?
Not very long. I ended up well, the war effort was beginning, and I went to work for North American Aviation, helping build B-25 bombers. I did some rivet work and various things there until it was time to go to the service.
What year did you go into the service?
I went in the service in 1942, September 1942.
What branch?
It was the Army Air Corps.
And what are your experiences from the service?
Well, I started out in the service with a buddy of mine, Leo Eisenberg, and I both joined, and we were fortunate in getting into what was known as the Army Air Corps. At that time, there wasn't an Air Corps separate division. The Air Corps was a division of the United States Army. So I was in the Army Air Corps, and when I first got in, they sent Leo and I to Fort Leavenworth. We joined and went in at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And then from Fort Leavenworth, they shipped us to a place that you wouldn't know. It's called, at that time it was Las Vegas, New Mexico. Camp Luna, Luna, and that's where we took our basic training. From there, they shipped both Leo and I to clear across the country to Homestead, Florida. Homestead, Florida is about almost as far south as you can go in Florida. It's probably about 35 or 40 miles south of Miami. And I ended up at Homestead, Florida, and then I was in Homestead for probably about 6 or 7 months, and that's when I got into, I had an opportunity to take a test where I got involved in instrument flying, and I became a link trainer instructor. Now, the link trainer was what was a forerunner to, and back in those days they called it blind flying, and that's exactly what it was. We had a device on the base that the student got into, and he operated this thing just like you would an airplane. And then we sat at a desk, and we had a device over there that was called a frog, and that sat on a big piece of paper, and every time he made a move in that inside of the link trainer, it reflected a move on that paper. So it showed exactly what he did, and we taught them various instrument procedures for flying without being able to see the ground, and that was called blind flying. It was instrument flying. They used various instruments that they had: altimeter, the ball bank indicator, the various devices, and then the big thing was the beam. They flew on the beam. Today things are so they're just cut and dried. It's so simple today with the modern technology, but back in those days they had a beam, and the signals were like the Morse code, a dot and a dash, and on the beam it was a solid tone. If you got off on the right side, you heard a dot and a dash, and if you got off on the left side, you heard a dash and a dot. But when you got on the beam, the two of them together made a solid hum. So that's how they followed the beam, and there was a beam that went from between air stations for all over the world, and that was instrument flying back in those days. And we had quite a number of students that came through that base, and then I was there for a good long while, and then they sent me to they sent me to Suisun Fairfield Army Air Base. Before that I went to Alpena. They shipped me to Alpena, Michigan. That was about as far north as you could go in Michigan. And that was an air base, and we had link trainers up there, and I worked in that division there with students that came in through that base. And then from there, I was there for probably 2 or 3 months. And then they shipped me to Suisun Fairfield Army Air Base, which was halfway between San Francisco and Sacramento. And I was at that base for probably about 3 months. And there I took some flight training, and I became involved as a crew member. And I ended up being a flight traffic clerk. I was a special mail messenger courier, and I was a crew member on the planes going back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. And my home base, they shipped me from there back to New York City. And I was detached from Fort Totten, but my home base, I flew out of LaGuardia Field. And it's all I did is I flew back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean 84 times. And
how long did that flight take in those days?
Well, the flight, you never took a straight across flight. The plane went through, but we didn't. In other words, my home base was LaGuardia Field. From LaGuardia Field, we'd take off and we'd go to Stevensville, Newfoundland. And our crew would get off. There was a crew there waiting. They would get on that plane and they would take it. Of course, when the plane came in, they gassed it up and got it ready for the next flight. That next crew got on that plane and they flew it, as an example, from Stevensville to Reykjavik, Iceland. And then that crew got off there and they went from Reykjavik, Iceland. The crew that plane went on to Orlyfield, Paris, or Prestwick, Scotland, which was more dominant field that we traveled to. And then we'd be there, and we'd turn around, and we'd come back. When we came back, there was they called it a crew rest. We'd be anywhere from a day to 3 days at most of these stops. And on the way back, you might fly from Stevensville or from Prestwick, Scotland, over to the Azore Islands. And then from the Azore Islands back to Stevensville and back to LaGuardia Field. So that's the kind of trips, and I made 84 flights across the ocean total, and most of the flights were fairly interesting.
Was that some kind of rough weather sometimes?
Oh yeah, very rough in the North Atlantic. Very rough.
You don't get used to that kind of thing, do you?
No, you don't. It gets fairly cool. We went up to our various bases. We went from LaGuardia Field to Stevensville, Newfoundland, or Goose Bay, Labrador, or from there to BW1 Greenland, which is the cold country, and or over there maybe we went over to Reykjavik, Iceland, or to Prestwick, Scotland, or then on the other hand we might have gone from LaGuardia Field to the Azores Islands, and from the Azores Islands over to Orly Field, Paris, or from the Azores Islands over to Casablanca. We went that way sometimes.
Did you run into any enemy planes during those trips?
Very rarely, very rarely. But we did fly. We flew across huge American ship armadas. There were hundreds of ships going across at one time, and you were always kind of concerned that someone might make a mistake, think we were the enemy, but we always came through clean.
And were they transporting these planes for the European to fight the war in Europe?
You mean our planes?
Yes.
Our operation was primarily, it was the Air Transport Command. We took dignitaries over. We took food over. We took medical supplies over. The planes always were flown over with a full load either way.
Mace, you said something about you'd land in a place and spend a day or a few days before you went off again. When you would come back to New York, what would you do?
Well, they never let us sit idly by. Because I was flying out of LaGuardia Field, and when I got married and brought Elaine back to New York with me. They let me live off the base. So I lived at 140-105. When we got married, I found a little apartment at 140-105 Northern Boulevard in Flushing, New York, and then I'd make my way to LaGuardia Field, which was our home base, and they always had the Army planes. If we were involved in it, they always gave us something to do, and one of the things that they had me doing was driving. Back in those days, it was driving a big forklift truck and helping to load the planes. And of course, I was involved in the weight and balance part of the aircraft too. And then, in addition to that, when I made these various trips, I also was a special mail and messenger courier. And we took quite a number of things over that were interesting, and we brought back a lot of interesting items. One time we brought back the first, supposedly we were told it was the first unexploded buzz bomb. We brought back, and we took it right to Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. Now a buzz bomb, as I recall, was a little bit larger around than a 55-gallon drum, and it was a good 30 feet in one part of it, and I forgot how long the nose of it was, but they had it disconnected in two pieces. And we brought that back and took it to Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. And we took various passengers over that were fairly well known. Our crew took over Paul Dudley, and he was a business manager for Glenn Miller, and some of their musicians also went on that flight. Our crew took over Supreme Court Justice Jackson, who ultimately ended up presiding over the Nuremberg trials. We flew him partway. I think we flew him to Paris, and then among some of the passengers we had on our plane there was Lowell Thomas, Jinx Falkenberg, Henry Louis Armstrong. There were quite a number of actors and actresses that were going on the USO tours, and we met them, would take them over.
Did you get to meet some of these people personally?
Oh yeah. Everybody was very nice. especially Lowell Thomas was a very friendly individual.
Now, when you would come back to New York, could you go home in the evenings to your apartment?
Yes,
If you were in town.
when I was in town, I could go back, but there were times when I had duty and I had to go to Fort Totten and spend some time there. That's where we were. That was our base back in the States at that time.
Now, let's go back. When did you meet Elaine?
Well, I met Elaine. I met Elaine in Kansas City. She came down to Kansas City and was a bridesmaid for my cousin, and I was a groom. I was one of the groomsmen. We met at my cousin's wedding.
And was it love at first sight, or did it take a little while?
Well, I won't say it was love at first sight, but we got along pretty well.
And then when did you get married after that?
We got married in 1944 during the war.
Now, when did you get out of the service, Mace?
In December, I think it was December 1945.
And what kind of work did you do when you came home?
When I came home, I stayed in New York for a little. When I got out, Elaine was working for the New York Times and didn't really want to stay in New York, and I didn't. And I stayed there for a little while, and I went to work for a manufacturing company in leather manufacturing. And after I got back, my brother and myself went into the luggage manufacturing business here in Omaha.
And you were manufacturing?
We were manufacturing luggage. And I stayed with that for about 12 years. But we were undercapitalized, and it was pretty tough. It was tough going. So I ended up selling out to him and ended up ultimately going into the real estate business.
And what brought you into the real estate business?
Well, I always kind of liked it, and I thought it was an interesting type of business, and it was okay. It's been good. I'm still working.
That's good. Keeping busy at it.
That's right.
What kind of outside activities have you had over the years, Mace?
Well, you mean other than my work? Well, I've got an old antique car that keeps me busy once in a while, and I've always done some ice skating, and in the wintertime we always skated at the Exarban Coliseum over there every Sunday for a good many years, and I still skated. I skated up until 2 years ago. And then I was going to try it again, but I don't think I will. I ride a bicycle once in a while. Then I've got an old antique car that keeps me busy.
Tell me about that car.
I've got a 1964 Bentley that I acquired, and it's a great old car, and it keeps me busy working on it, keeping it in shape, and then going to different things.
Are you able to get parts for the car when you need it?
Oh yeah, it's tough, but you can get them.
And what kind of work do you do on it when you tinker with it?
Well, there's just a lot of different things. I don't do the tune-ups or the real technical things. I've got an older gent that handles that part of it, but keeping the car try to keep it in good shape, you know, the various things that you do on most cars. It's all leather inside, and you want to take care of that, and it's wood inside also. A lot of wood in it.
Where did you come across that car?
Through a series of events, I acquired it through my son, John.
And you've been in love with it since?
That's right. It's a great old piece.
Now I want to hear about your children.
Well, I've got a son, John. By the way, when I was flying, I made an occasional trip to Casablanca, and that was an interesting town. And I want to say that I was in Casablanca before Humphrey Bogart was.
Have you had a chance to go back since those years?
No, I've never gone back to over there in that area. I've gone a lot of other places.
And Tell me how your life has been the last few years.
Well, I think it's been great. My health has been fairly good outside of one little problem I had, but outside of that, I've been getting along fine. I work just about every day and take an occasional trip with my wife, and we get along real well.
Mace, can you call some experiences of growing up that really stick in your mind?
Well, one of the things when I was growing up, and I lived at 4012 Flora, when I went from grade school to junior high, Westport Junior High School, I had a neighbor about 3 doors down from me on Flora, Leroy Marinas, and Leroy ice skated also. And we had some weather that was absolutely solid ice all over town. So Leroy and I each put our ice skates on, and we skated clear to school all the way, both going and coming. And we didn't hit any concrete at all. It was that much ice. It was kind of interesting, and I never did forget that.
Did you take your regular shoes with you so you wouldn't have to walk around in ice skates?
Well, back in those days, I had clamp-on skates. You clamped them right on like you did roller skates. You clamped them with a skate key, clamped them right on my shoes. And I don't remember what Leroy had. I think he had the same thing.
And I understand you're still doing, or you still did a lot of ice
I
skating.
did up until about 1.5, 2 years ago. I think I'm a little afraid to try it again, but I might. Another thing I might, it was kind of an interesting thing. When I was probably about 13, 14 years old, and we had to move down to 215 West 18th Street in Kansas City, which was about 5 or 6 blocks to the downtown area where my dad had his little store, so he could walk to work and make it much easier. I worked next door in this, we lived in a fourplex apartment right next door in a house. In this house, there was a sign shop, and the sign painter's name was Buell F. Porter. And Buell was a cantankerous type of an individual, but he was very interesting. And then down the basement, there was a print shop, Jim Brockman and Pop Brockman. And they had the printing presses down there. Jim set the type, and old Pop ran the press, a hand-fed press. You know, he'd reach over and pull one piece out and take another piece and put it in, and the press would close and print it. So that was interesting to watch. And all of the people, it seemed like all the people in that business, both sign painting and printing in that business, had a heavy addiction to alcohol. And those fellas drank all the time. Buell F. Porter was reputed to be the fastest sign painter in the Kansas City area. And he had probably 3 or 4 sheets of plywood up against the wall, and that stretched out probably, about 24 to 30 feet long. And he had a big roll with white butcher paper, and he'd pull out the white butcher paper, take a ruler and put a pencil up there and walk down the length of that thing and make his marks. And he had a short cut-off paintbrush with real thin paint, and he would walk down that. And as an example now, he painted banners that went in marquees on signs, and he also painted those same type of banners for what they called sound trucks or sound cars. Back in those days, they'd take a great big old car. Back in those days, it might have been an old Piercero or an old Rio or something like that, and it had a big post on the front bumper and one on the back bumper, and then they had a big wooden poster up there, and they took these banners that Buell painted and they would put them up there with thumbtacks. And this sound car with that banner up there would go through the different neighborhoods, and they played music, and the fella had had a microphone, and he'd say, come to the Bijou Theater tonight and see Tarzan of the Apes or whatever it was. And he painted these banners and these sound cars. They bought them and put them in there. And the sign company, the sign men over there, there were a number of different people that worked there. Another individual that came to mind was a fellow by the name of Eddie O'Toole. Eddie O'Toole was in the First World War, and he gave me his original Army bugle. So I've got it someplace in my trunk, a World War I Army bugle. And Eddie O'Toole was another salty character. But these fellows never stopped drinking. And what they did after they finished a bottle of booze, this was an old house that they had. As I'd say, the sign company, sign painter was on the first floor, and the print shop was in the basement. And these fellows, it was a common thing. Instead of drinking coffee or drinking tea or anything, they had a bottle of booze, and they were always taking a swig. And they took their old bottles and they put them all in the bathtub. And maybe once every month or so, Jim Brockman would run out of money and want a drink, or Buell Porter would, and they'd say, Mace, come on over here, sit down on this toilet, and they'd get a quart bottle out of that bathtub and a little funnel, and they say, open up all these and pour what booze you can in here. And after I go through every bottle that was in that bathtub before we threw it away, we might have had maybe about 3 inches worth of booze in that. A full bathtub full of old bottles, what we call dead soldiers. I never did forget that.
What a memory.
That was, it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was a great memory. Well, I guess I've said about everything I can think of, and I wanted to tell everybody, all of you, that John and Grant and Aaliyah, I love you all. I hope you're going to have a great life. I love you being with me, and great seeing you all the time. And to Larry and Malie and to Sarah and Jessica, I love you all. Hope you're all well and stay well. And great being with you all the time. And to my lovely wife Elaine, I love you dearly, and I've had a great life with you. And I hope you get along real well. Bye-bye.